Section 4 of The Willows. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Robinson. The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. 4. It's the Willows, of course. The Willows mask the others, but the others are feeling about for us. If we let our minds betray our fear, we're lost utterly. He looked at me with an expression so calm, so determined, so sincere that I no longer had any doubts as to his sanity. He was as sane as any man ever was. If we can hold out through the night, he added, we may get off in the daylight unnoticed, or rather, undiscovered. But you really think a sacrifice would— That gong-like humming came down very close over our heads as I spoke, but it was my friend's scared face that really stopped my mouth. "Hush!" he whispered, holding up his hand. "Do not mention them more than you can help. Do not refer to them by name. To name is to reveal. It is the inevitable clue, and our only hope lies in ignoring them in order that they may ignore us." Even in thought? He was extraordinarily agitated. "Especially in thought. Our thoughts make spirals in their world. We must keep them out of our minds at all costs, if possible." I raked the fire together to prevent the darkness having everything its own way. I never longed for the sun as I longed for it then, in the awful blackness of that summer night. "Were you awake all last night?" he went on suddenly. "I slept badly a little after dawn," I replied evasively, trying to follow his instructions, which I knew instinctively were true. "But the wind, of course—" "I know, but the wind won't account for all the noises." "Then you heard it too?" "The multiplying countless little footsteps I heard," he said, adding, after a moment's hesitation, "and that other sound." "You mean above the tent, and the pressing down upon us of something tremendous, gigantic?" He nodded significantly. "It was like the beginning of a sort of inner suffocation," I said. "Partly, yes. It seemed to me that the weight of the atmosphere had been altered, had increased enormously, so that we should have been crushed. And that," I went on, determined to have it all out, pointing upwards where the gong-like note hummed ceaselessly, rising and falling like wind. "What do you make of that?" "It's their sound," he whispered gravely. "It's the sound of their world, the humming in their region. The division here is so thin that it leaks through somehow. But if you listen carefully, you'll find it's not above so much as around us. It's in the willows. It's the willows themselves humming, because here the willows have been made symbols of the forces that are against us." I could not follow exactly what he meant by this, yet the thought and idea in my mind were beyond question the thought and idea in his. I realized what he realized, only with less power of analysis than his. It was on the tip of my tongue to tell him at last about my hallucination of the ascending figures and the moving bushes, when he suddenly thrust his face again close into mine across the firelight and began to speak in a very earnest whisper. He amazed me by his calmness and pluck, his apparent control of the situation. This man I had for years deemed unimaginative, stolid. "Now listen," he said. "The only thing for us to do is to go on as though nothing had happened, follow our usual habits, go to bed and so forth, pretend we feel nothing and notice nothing. It is a question wholly of the mind, and the less we think about them the better our chance of escape. Above all, don't think. for what you think happens." "All right," I managed to reply, simply breathless with his words and the strangeness of it all. "All right, I'll try, but tell me one more thing first. Tell me what you make of those hollows in the ground all about us, those sand funnels." "No!" he cried, forgetting to whisper in his excitement. "I dare not, simply dare not put the thought into words. If you have not guessed, I am glad. Don't try to. They have put it into my mind. Try your hardest to prevent their putting it into yours." He sank his voice again to a whisper before he finished, and I did not press him to explain. There was already just about as much horror in me as I could hold. The conversation came to an end, and we smoked our pipes busily in silence. Then something happened, something unimportant apparently, as the way is when the nerves are in a very great state of tension, and this small thing for a brief space gave me an entirely different point of view. I chanced to look down at my sandshoe, the sort we used for the canoe, and something to do with the hole at the toe suddenly recalled to me the London shop where I had bought them, the difficulty the man had in fitting me, and other details of the uninteresting but practical operation. At once in its train followed a wholesome view of the modern sceptical world I was accustomed to move in at home. I thought of roast beef, an ale, motor cars, policemen, brass bands, and a dozen other things that proclaim the soul of ordinariness or utility. The effect was immediate and astonishing even to myself. Psychologically, I suppose it was simply a sudden and violent reaction, after the strain of living in an atmosphere of things that to the normal consciousness must seem impossible and incredible. But whatever the cause, it momentarily lifted the spell from my heart, and left me for the short space of a minute feeling free and utterly unafraid. I looked up at my friend opposite. "You damned old pagan!" I cried, laughing aloud in his face. "You imaginative idiot! You superstitious idolater! You—" I stopped in the middle, seized anew by the old horror. I tried to smother the sound of my voice as something sacrilegious. The Swede, of course, heard it too, the strange cry overhead in the darkness, and that sudden drop in the air as though something had come nearer. He had turned ashen white under the tan. He stood bolt upright in front of the fire, stiff as a rod, staring at me. "After that," he said in a sort of helpless, frantic way, "we must go. We can't stay now. We must strike camp this very instant and go on, down the river." He was talking, I saw, quite wildly, his words dictated by abject terror, the terror he had resisted so long but which had caught him at last. "In the dark?" I exclaimed, shaking with fear after my hysterical outburst, but still realizing our position better than he did. "Sheer madness. The river's in flood, and we've only got a single paddle. Besides, we only go deeper into their country. There's nothing ahead for 50 miles but willows, willows, willows!" He sat down again in a state of semi-collapse. The positions, by one of those kaleidoscopic changes nature loves, were suddenly reversed, and the control of our forces passed over into my hands. His mind at last had reached the point where it was beginning to weaken. "What on earth possessed you to do such a thing?" he whispered with the awe of genuine terror in his voice and face. I crossed round to his side of the fire. I took both his hands in mine, kneeling down beside him and looking straight into his frightened eyes. "We'll make one more blaze," I said firmly, "and then turn in for the night. At sunrise we'll be off full speed for Camorn. Now pull yourself together a bit, and remember your own advice about not thinking fear." He said no more, and I saw that he would agree and obey. In some measure, too, it was a sort of relief to get up and make an excursion into the darkness for more wood. We kept close together, almost touching, groping among the bushes and along the bank. The humming overhead never ceased, but seemed to me to grow louder as we increased our distance